Hey, what is going on everybody, and welcome to Fantasia. For today, we're going to be jumping into another session of Epic 7. Now today, got another balance adjustment preview for you guys. That's right, it's already been a couple of months, and now it is time to take a look at what Smilegate decides needs some change. And I can already tell you right off the bat, I've already looked at this, and MLK Ron and Emma Rowana are not one of them. So let's go ahead and take a look now, shall we? There are going to be 7 heroes, 3 artifacts, and actually 1 skill debuff that's going to be changed. So these are the targets right here. We got Ruel of Light, Lionheart Sermia, Haste, Tinebra, Mort, Silk, Soothin, Rise of a Monarch, Dux Noctis, Steadfast Gatekeeper, and Restrict. So, quite interesting, right? Just in summary, Ruel probably needs a little bit of change. She is kind of a worse Destina. She's a really good single target healer and reviver, for sure. But with the amount of AoE debuffs and the amount of AoE damage that can come out, it's really hard for her to sustain, and she has some pretty long cooldowns. Lionheart Sermia, don't know why she's here. Maybe she's gonna maybe they're gonna fix an error with her where, you know, you always dual attack into one when you don't have any dual attack skills or unity sets. Maybe. Haste, he's kind of been buffed before, so I don't really know why they're tweaking him so soon now. Maybe trying to push for him to be used. I don't really see it though. Tinebra, kind of nice actually. Although this is kind of like her 15th buff, so she's been buffed like every other balance patch since the beginning of time. Mort getting a change is pretty nice because he's actually really close to being such a solid unit, but he's just 2 RNG. Silk and Soothin don't really know all too much about, and they're probably not going to be too impactful. Rise of a Monarch, Dux Noctis, and Steadfast Gatekeeper, we'll get into those, but artifacts getting buffed is typically very nice, and Restrict is a very strange one to see. But now let's go ahead and get into the details. So, starting off with Ruel of Light, we have her skill 1, Key to an Oath. It used to deal damage and heal. Well, so first it dealt damage proportional to her max health, and then it healed proportional to the ally's max health, right? So if you S1 and it, let's say, healed a Crow or something, it'll heal percentage of his health. Whereas if you healed a damage dealer, let's say like Milam, she has lower total health, and it's going to increase the same percentage. So Milam would technically get healed less than Crow would. Right? They're changing it now so that the damage dealt and the amount recovered increases proportional to Ruel's health. So if you S1'd, Crow would get the flat increase amount based on Ruel's HP, and Milam would get the same flat amount proportional to Ruel's HP, right? So that means that squishier units are actually going to get an easier time getting healed by Ruel, which is kind of nice. Because typically you're not really trying to heal up your knights and stuff when you're S1ing, you're trying to heal up your damage dealers, right? And that really does help a little bit in terms of her heals, because her cooldowns are pretty long, which means her S1 is actually kind of essential for upkeeping your team during that downtime if you've already popped your S2 or S3. Speaking of other skills, her S2 now will increase combat readiness of the caster by 25%. So that's actually not that bad. Kind of giving that kind of Destina treatment here where she gets the turn cycle a little bit, which is nice. Because again, her skill cooldowns are quite long, so the more you're able to turn cycle her, the better, and her base speed is kind of abysmal. Overall, changes to Ruel, pretty decent. I don't know how impactful this is going to be. She's going to be a fantastic Guild War unit for sure. But in terms of RTA, not quite sure if this is going to kind of push her over the edge, because Destina is still kind of reigning on top in terms of Soul Weavers. Right, moving on, we got Lionheart Sermia. Really don't know why they buffed Lionheart Sermia. 2 quick little changes. With her passive, whenever she gets hit by an extra attack, counter attack, or dual attack, not only will she dispel all the debuffs that are inflicted onto her, but she'll also increase her combat readiness by 20%. That makes her really, really solid, and honestly very scary as well, because now she can cut, and she can also deal more damage. That's right. They increased her damage on her S3. The reasoning is that there's a lot of damage mitigation going around, and she has a hard time dealing proper damage with her S3. I can kind of see it in that her S3 is a little bit weak at times, especially if you're fighting into another standard team, like standard v standard. She has a little bit of a harder time cutting through people's defenses early on into the match. Now, later on into the match, defense scaling units are absolutely amazing because there's nothing in Frenzy that impacts defense. But this damage dealt is definitely going to matter. She's going to end matches really quickly now, especially with this combat readiness increase. Definitely very scary and something to look out for, right? Much harder to control, but we'll get into control in just a bit too. All right, moving on, we got Haste. So these are the RGB units. Now Moonlights are done. Haste had a buff before that made him essentially like a Fire Ron, but now they gave, I believe they even gave this to him like the last balance patch where he has a 75% chance to steal a buff from an opponent. But now they're changing it to a 50% chance to decrease defense for 2 turns, which is actually not a bad change. Decreased defense is obviously more useful than stealing a buff. And stealing buffs kind of matter in longer fights, but Haste is more of an aggressive, fast type of unit, kind of an opener. So it didn't really synergize too well with his kills. Kind of questionable when they gave it to him anyway at the beginning. I think before that he had like bleeds or something even more worthless, but not a bad change for you Haste users out there. I know there are a few of you guys. And then they also decreased the cooldowns of the S3 by 1 turn. So now you have faster turn cycling just built in. I know there's an EE, so let's go and talk about that. The EE here is that when used S1, you increase combat readiness by 15%. That's going to be changed so that the decreased defense chance is actually increased by 15%. So you have a 65% chance of defense break on S1. Not too bad. That's a 2 and 3, right? And then the other exclusive equipment, which decreased the S3 by 1 turn, that's actually going to extend the buff duration of bleed inflicted by the S3 by 1 turn. Now, that doesn't really matter all too much, seeing as you inflict 2 bleeding effects for 2 turns, 2 bleeding effects for 3 turns really doesn't do much at all. I'm gonna assume that most people are probably gonna be using this decreased defense chance by 15%. I don't know how good he is in like PvE content. I know he's kind of like a PvP unit, sort of. I think they're kind of pushing for that, but he might have some use. Let me know in the comments down below, you Haste users, where you see success with him, and if these changes actually matter. All right, moving on, we got Fire Tinebra getting her 20 millionth buff. It's like her, Ravi, and Melissa, right? They're like the golden children of Epic 7 here. But Nibria actually has some pretty interesting stuff. So on her S2, I believe, this attacks all enemies, decreases combat readiness by 30%, and decreases speed, and now she will restrict for 2 turns. Soul Burn is going to be changed so that she increases damage dealt on her S2 instead of on her S3. Now, this is actually pretty interesting. Most bosses can actually be restricted. I personally use Tinebra in PvE content, but I know some people use Tinebra in PvP. This is going to be pretty decent. Pushing things back, decreasing speed, and restricting means that that unit's essentially not going to be taking a turn, right? Tinebra could actually be part of a pretty decent control team, now that I think about it, especially with her S3. So her S3 here already had a chance to decrease defense and puts them to sleep for a turn, and it increases her attack for 2 turns. What they did was they reduced the cooldown by 1 turn, which actually helps quite a bit, because everyone essentially used that EE, right? You wanted to turn cycle your S3, whether in PvP or PvE. You want to get the defense breaks in PvE, you want to get the sleeps in PvP. But now they're changing it so that the cooldown decreases. We'll get into the EE in just a bit. And they're also changing her imprint concentration now. So instead of having a dual attack chance, she gets effectiveness, which is good. Because dual attack chances, let's be honest here, absolute trash imprint. But concentration for effectiveness can help her a lot, especially because she works with debuffs so much, and she really wants to land those, right? So now, even in PvE, the effectiveness is going to be nice. If you use her in PvE and you have imprints, you can focus more into some damage stats or some bulk to keep her alive, and then not focus too much on this stat here. But moving on, we got the EE. So instead of decreasing the cooldown of her S3 by 1 turn, she instead grants herself greater attack buff when using S3. So it's kind of going to be like how... God, I'm like blanking on the unit that also does this. But greater attack buff going to be pretty nice, especially because you get to keep it for 2 turns, right? Again, PvE can be great. For PvP, I've seen some people try using Tinebra as like a huge damage dealing nuke. I believe I fought one in an RTA video before, so that guy is definitely going to be ecstatic about a greater attack buff. Alright, moving on though, we got Mort, and honestly, the Great Mort Elixir are probably one of the best changes, and probably, in my opinion, one of the most impactful changes that we're going to see. So his S2, his passive, he always had a 50% chance to activate his passive skill, which gave you a crit resist buff to everybody for a turn. Now he has a 100% chance to activate that, which is huge, because Mort's shortcomings were essentially that he was 2 RNG and he was not consistent, right? So nobody really wanted to use him for a chance to get an anti-crit buff. But now 100% chance makes him super, super nice. Plus what they did was they decreased the cooldown of his S3. This is huge because now you're going to keep your enraged up essentially all the time, and he does recover health with his S3, so you're going to be getting some decent healing out of this too in terms of cycling. They did decrease the amount you healed, and they decreased the amount of souls that you get, but it doesn't matter. Keeping that rage on your Mort essentially allows you to get extra speed bonuses on top of his speed buff that he gets from his passive. But it also makes it so that he ignores resistance on his S1. If he's enraged and you S1, he can defense break and ignore resist, right? So by keeping this up pretty much the entire fight, he's going to be really, really scary, and I think Mort can actually have a place in the meta, especially with so many ice units that are built with resist, right? You got Karina, right, who's a defense scaler, Arya, who's a defense scaler, usually built with resist as well. He's going to be pretty nice into those two. And he's going to be decent into something like Shu as well, because the anti-crit being more consistent means that if Shu attacks you and she doesn't crit, there's no chance for her to foosh, because she has to crit in order to proc foosh. So Mort's going to be pretty good. Can't wait to use him after the buff. Okay, so moving on, we got Silk. Not really sure what they're doing with Silk here, but maybe they're trying to push her as like an imprint unit and just trying to give her some more utility. So what Silk does is now she decreases combat readiness by 10%. It's kind of the same as before, but the combat readiness changes were removed here, right? I believe it's just flat 20% now. They changed all these modifiers here to damage, which doesn't really matter all too much. But then you have her passive. So her passive, she always gained 1 focus at the start of her turn, and then whenever she's attacked, she consumes a focus. So a little bit like Sylvan Sage, except there's no mitigation here. But she will dispel a debuff now from herself, and increase combat readiness by 15% when she's attacked. Before it was only an increase by 15%. And now when she is focus of 2 or more, she always uses a different firing animation. It's called automatic fire, and it used to just increase damage dealt, but now it's going to attack the enemy and decrease their combat readiness by 10%. And then the damage dealt is going to increase proportional to her speed, and it penetrates the target's defense by 20%, and this attack receives effects that are applied to basic skills. So if you have some basic skill artifacts, I believe that's what it's talking about, then they do apply to this skills effect too, which is not bad. I don't really know what they're pushing with Silk here, so we're just going to have to wait and see. If you guys have any ideas, let me know in the comments down below. But to me, this looks kind of like a filler unit buff, because I believe they changed Silk, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they changed Silk before as well in the past, but yeah. Anyway, moving on, we got a 3-star here, Moonlight 3-star Soothin. So his passive says after attacking, increases attack and effectiveness by 5% and can stack up to 10 times. Now he can increase attack, defense, and effectiveness by 5%, and can stack up to 10 times. I can already tell you right off the bat, this thing is not really going to change anything whatsoever, mostly because of the fact that you have to stack up to 10 times, right? Imagine if Landy, right, Earth Landy, imagine if to get her maximum amount of attack, she had to stack up to 10 times. She had to attack 10 times, because this is after attacking, right? Imagine if Bologna, in order to get ML Bologna, right? Imagine if she needed to attack 10 times in order to get the maximum number of stacks. It's just not really realistic. They could have changed this to stack to 5 times, perhaps, and then each time he increases by 10%. I don't really see him used anywhere, but perhaps this might be a PvE unit. Not really sure. It's a little weird for a PvE unit because he inflicts unhealable and he has burn effects. And this thing inflicts 2 burn effects now instead of 1. So, again, not really sure what this is for. Perhaps you Abyss runners out there can tell me if Suthin actually is used to cheese some stages or something like that. But yeah, anyway, not a really impactful change right there. Now, moving on though, we do have some pretty good things for artifacts. Rise of a Monarch, which I actually do really like as an artifact, one of my favorite knight artifacts that just wasn't really too viable because you just granted a barrier. It's like an FCC passive, right, in an artifact form. Now the change is that you increase defense of all allies by 10% and not just the wearer. That's huge. Rise of a Monarch now can be very nice for protecting the team, and this defense increase can actually help quite a bit, because artifacts, they add on after all of your, I believe they add on after all of your stats, right? So I think they're based off of your unit's total stat line. It's kind of like why Lili's artifact is super strong, is because it doesn't increase the health percentage off of the base health. I believe it increases the health percentage off of your unit's build health, right? So if she has like 20k HP, that's 10% of that 20k. All right, but moving on here. Back to Rise of a Monarch, I think it's going to be pretty nice. Don't know how viable it's going to be in PvP, but more variety in terms of knight artifacts is always welcome, right? Moving on though to Dux Noctis, they're giving this treatment that's very similar to what we saw with, what is it called, Wind Rider. So Wind Rider used to have to kill to get like the attack bonuses, but now instead of that, they're just saying, hey, you get a flat attack bonus to your ranger, and after an ally attacks, they're actually not nerfing this, which is good. So the 2 to 4% still stays, and it can only stack up to 6 times instead of up to 8 times. And honestly, decreasing the number of times that it needs to stack to max is huge. Because again, like I mentioned with Suthin up here, it's unrealistic to expect something to stack this many times for attacking. Now this, fortunately, is not the caster attacking. It is when an ally makes a crit. So that helps out a little bit more. All right, moving on though, Steadfast Gatekeeper. This is actually an artifact I was running on Rose for my Fire Expedition, but they're tweaking it now to make it actually pretty good for PvE. So you get to increase the defense of everybody by 5%, kind of the similar change to up here with Rise of a Monarch, but now you decrease damage suffered from elite or boss monsters by up to 20%. This is a 4-star artifact, so it's easy to max limit break. The effect does not stack with other artifacts of the same name, right? And then only that damage reduction can only apply, the strongest effect can apply. Now, I think this is pretty decent. It's a 4-star artifact that does this. I believe there's already an artifact that does this where it decreases damage suffered by the boss monsters. Now, I don't know how viable, again, I don't know how viable this is. This effect doesn't apply to all allies. You're not reducing the damage that everyone takes. That could actually change the PvE meta a little bit for expeditions, for certain ones maybe. But yeah, no, not quite that super impactful, but we'll see how it works, right? We'll see how it works. There is a recall though, so if you do have Steadfast Gatekeeper leveled up, you can recall that artifact, get those EXP charms back. Highly recommend you do that. Even if you want to build Steadfast Gatekeeper again, get those charms back, and you can test the artifact out first before considering leveling it again. All right, and then last but not least, the most surprising one of all is they buffed Restrict. I don't know why they buffed Restrict, because it's already such a powerful effect. Restrict stops standard players from cutting aggro and cleave players, where you know, if you put restrict on things like Peyra, for example, puts restrict. You can restrict things like Sage Ball. If you have enough effectiveness, you can restrict cleansers, right? So things like DJB, you can restrict ML Calrix from cutting with Warhorn, because he can't cleanse until he takes a turn. Yeah, it's a very, very powerful effect, but look what they're doing now. They're removing the fact that you can't decrease combat readiness of units with restrict, right? So now those units with restrict just can't increase their combat readiness effects, except with their speed, just normally moving down the CR bar. That's huge, because what this means is if you have a unit with restrict on the team, you can fully control your opponent and absolutely decimate them, because not only can they not push themselves up, but if you have a decreased speed debuff and you have other units that can push back combat readiness, yeah, your opponent might not ever take a turn. This is actually quite scary. Those of you guys who are around for the Cerise meta, Cerise and Fairy Tale Tinebria meta, it was like a control meta back then. That was scary times, right? People were busting out things like Champion Zerato for that stuff. But, I mean, I guess now with Dilibet and Ed, Dilibet was accessible back then too, but maybe it's a little less scary. I don't know. But anyway, that is going to be the end of the balance patch preview. Let me know what you guys think about it. What was your favorite change? And what is your thought, especially on that restrict buff, right? So, with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe for more Epic 7 content. And until next time, take care.